warm Friday morning in June 2018, across the United States, heavy metal doors rolled down and the lights flickered off for the final time. More than 700 stores locked their entrances, leaving behind nothing but yellow liquidation banners and a deafening silence. This wasn't just another retail failure. It was the abrupt end of an American institution. For decades, it was the ultimate wonderland, a magical kingdom where aisles stretched like colorful canyons, stacked high with every board game, action figure, and video game imaginable. It was a place that practically defined weekends and holiday seasons, grossing tens of billions of dollars and holding the entire toy industry in the palm of its hand. Yet the empire that effortlessly crushed local competitors and commanded absolute loyalty from generations of children was suddenly reduced to a hollow shell, suffocating under the devastating weight of a multi-billion-dollar debt. The cheerful mascot who once promised we'd never have to grow up was now packing a suitcase into the dark. How does a retail juggernaut, practically woven into the DNA of consumer culture, suffocate in the very era when the global toy market is booming? Was it truly the ruthless efficiency of online shopping that dug the grave? Or was there a far darker force of Wall Street greed pulling the strings behind the scenes? This is the story of ToysRUs. We will peel back the bright neon facade to uncover the hubris, the crushing leveraged buyouts, and the tragic missteps that tore down a paradise. Let's walk through those automatic doors one last time to discover how the ultimate category killer ultimately killed itself. The year was 1948. World War II had finally drawn to a close, and the United States was standing on the precipice of a profound societal transformation. Millions of soldiers were returning home, starting families, and moving into the rapidly expanding suburbs. This era of unprecedented optimism gave birth to the baby boom, an explosion in the birth rate that would alter the trajectory of American consumerism forever. In Washington, D.C., a 25-year-old veteran and former cryptographer named Charles Lazarus recognized this demographic tidal wave not just as a cultural shift, but as a once-in-a-lifetime business opportunity. With instinct and a modest amount of capital, Lazarus opened a small storefront called Children's Bargain Town. Initially, the store had absolutely nothing to do with action figures or board games. It was strictly a baby furniture business, selling cribs, strollers, and high chairs to the eager new parents of the post-war era. For a while, the business was steady, but as Lazarus manned the cash register and observed the purchasing habits of his customers, he noticed a fundamental flaw in his business model. A family would come in and buy a sturdy wooden crib, but they would not return for another one unless they had another child. The furniture was built to last, which meant repeat business was slow. However, customers frequently asked if he carried smaller items to keep their infants entertained. Recognizing the demand, Lazarus added a few basic toys to his inventory. The result was an immediate revelation. While a crib was a one-time purchase, toys were entirely different. They were outgrown, lost, or broken, requiring constant replacement. More importantly, toys were driven by passing fads, holidays, and birthdays. They generated an endless cycle of returning customers. Realizing that the real money was not in the wood and metal of baby furniture, but in the colorful, ephemeral world of play, Lazarus made a pivotal decision that would change retail history. He pivoted his entire business model toward toys. By 1957, Lazarus had refined his vision. He needed a new name, something short, catchy, and memorable for children. He settled on ToysRUs, famously turning the R backward to mimic a child's handwriting. But the name was only the superficial layer of a much deeper retail revolution. Lazarus had been watching the rise of self-service grocery supermarkets, a relatively new concept at the time. Before this era, shopping for non-grocery items usually involved a clerk standing behind a counter, fetching products for the customer. Lazarus decided to apply the supermarket model to the toy industry. When the first official Toys R Us opened, it was unlike anything the American public had ever seen. There were no clerks behind glass cases. Instead, customers grabbed a shopping cart and pushed it down wide, brightly lit aisles. The shelves were stacked high to the ceiling with a dizzying array of merchandise. From dolls and tricycles to board games and puzzles, The sheer volume of inventory was staggering. This model introduced a sharp new tension into the retail landscape, the trade-off between personalized service and overwhelming variety. Lazarus was deliberately sacrificing the intimate, hands-on customer service of the traditional neighborhood toy shop in favor of massive scale and aggressively discounted pricing. He operated on a high-volume, low-margin philosophy. By purchasing goods in massive quantities directly from manufacturers, he could offer prices that small, independent toy shops simply could not match. This strategy gave birth to what economists and business historians would later call the category killer. Toys R Us was not trying to sell everything like a traditional department store. It was laser-focused on one specific category, but it offered such a deep, exhaustive selection within that category that it completely monopolized the market. Customers no longer had to wonder if a specific toy was in stock. If it existed, Toys R Us had it. The strategy was ruthless, efficient, and wildly successful. The stores became destinations in themselves, cavernous warehouses of joy where children could wander for hours, overwhelmed by the visual spectacle of thousands of toys. Charles Lazarus had not just built a store, he had engineered a highly efficient retail machine perfectly calibrated to exploit the post-war economic boom. He had tapped into the deep psychological desire of baby boomer parents to give their children the affluent, toy-filled childhoods they themselves had been denied during the Great Depression and the war. As the 1950s gave way to the 1960s, the blueprint was set. The small baby furniture shop had evolved into an unstoppable force, laying the unshakable foundation for an empire that was preparing to conquer the entire nation. As the 1960s transitioned into the 1970s, the American landscape was being physically rewritten. The interstate highway system carved through the country, giving rise to sprawling suburbs and massive strip malls. Charles Lazarus saw these expanding concrete horizons not as empty space, but as the perfect habitat for his giant toy warehouses. The blueprint was proven. Now it was time to scale. Toys R Us embarked on an era of aggressive, relentless expansion, replicating its cavernous, brightly lit stores in suburban plazas across the nation. To soften the intimidating scale of these massive warehouses, the company needed a friendly face. They founded in a mascot that would soon become as recognizable as Mickey Mouse to a generation of American children. Originally introduced in print advertisements during the 1950s as a bespectacled intellectual named Dr. G. Raff, the character was redesigned, softened, and rebranded as Jeffrey the Giraffe. With his cheerful smile and stars on his neck, Jeffrey became the charismatic ambassador of the brand. He transformed cold, giant retail spaces into magical destinations. But Jeffrey was only one piece of the marketing puzzle. The true cultural takeover occurred in 1982, when the company unleashed a television commercial that would permanently etch itself into the collective memory of the United States. Featuring a catchy, upbeat melody, the jingle proclaimed, "I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid. There's a million toys at Toys R Us that I can play with." This wasn't just a clever piece of advertising, it was a psychological masterstroke. It bypassed the parents entirely and spoke directly to the children, turning them into the company's most effective sales force. It framed adulthood as something to be avoided and positioned the store as a sanctuary of eternal youth. For millions of kids watching Saturday morning cartoons, a trip to Toys R Us was no longer just an errand. It was a pilgrimage. It was an event to be negotiated for, begged for, and dreamed about. However, behind the infectious jingles and the smiling giraffe, Toys R Us was operating with the cold, calculating efficiency of an apex predator. As their footprint expanded to hundreds of locations, their buying power grew exponentially. By the 1980s, they were selling more than $1 billion worth of toys annually, commanding a staggering share of the total market. This sheer volume gave them unprecedented, almost dictatorial leverage over the toy industry's biggest manufacturers. Companies like Mattel, Hasbro, and Kenner quickly realized a terrifying truth. Toys R Us was no longer just a retailer, they were the gatekeepers of success. If a toy manufacturer wanted a new action figure or board game to be a hit, It absolutely had to secure prime shelf space in Lazarus's stores. Without the blessing of Toys R Us buyers, a product was essentially dead on arrival. Lazarus and his executives knew their power, and they wielded it ruthlessly. They began to dictate terms to the manufacturers. They demanded exclusive products, early release windows, and rock-bottom wholesale prices. If a toy maker refused to comply, Toys R Us could simply threaten to bury their products on the bottom shelves, or worse, drop them from the inventory entirely. The tail was now wagging the dog. The retailer was controlling the creators. This ruthless efficiency birthed a profound tension in the retail landscape. The phenomenal rise of Toys R Us triggered a mass extinction event for independent businesses. Mom-and-pop toy shops, the charming, intimate stores that had served local neighborhoods for decades, were systematically annihilated. They simply could not buy inventory cheaply enough to match the heavily discounted prices of the category killer. They couldn't stock the sheer variety, nor could they afford the massive television campaigns. One by one, local toy shop owners locked their doors for the final time, unable to compete with the neon glow of the giant toy supermarket down the highway. By the end of the 1980s, Toys R Us was practically a monopoly in its sector. It had achieved retail supremacy, operating not just as a store, but as a dominant cultural institution. They had conquered the suburbs, crushed their smaller rivals, and brought the mighty toy manufacturers to heel. The empire was expanding internationally, the profits were staggering, and the future seemed to stretch out endlessly, as bright and limitless as the aisles of the stores themselves. But in their absolute triumph, the seeds of a dangerous arrogance were already being sown. The 1990s marked the absolute zenith of the Toys R Us empire. This was an era before smartphones, before iPads, and long before the convenience of one-click doorstep delivery. In this analog golden age, the physical toy store was not just a retail outlet, it was the undisputed center of a child's universe. For the millennial generation growing up during this decade, Toys R Us transcended the concept of commerce to become a deeply ingrained cultural tradition. The experience was highly sensory and universally understood. It began the moment the automatic glass doors slid open, releasing a rush of air conditioning and that distinct, unforgettable scent of fresh cardboard and new plastic. Inside, the scale was breathtaking. Aisles stretched out like vibrant canyons, color-coded and meticulously categorized. There was the blindingly pink Barbie aisle, the sprawling landscape of Lego sets, and the action figure section where the latest Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles or Power Rangers hung from thousands of pegs. For older kids, the video game aisle was sacred ground. It was an era of glass display cases where consumers couldn't actually touch the games. Instead, they had to flip through a wall of plastic flaps, hoping to find a paper slip underneath their desired Nintendo or Sega game. Taking that fragile paper slip to the cashier felt like holding a winning lottery ticket. The store's influence peaked during the holiday season. Weeks before Thanksgiving, the annual Toys R Us Big Toy Book would arrive in mailboxes across America. It was a massive, glossy catalog that functioned as a child's ultimate wish list. Kids would spend hours sprawled on living room floors, using thick markers to circle every item they wanted, effectively handing their parents a neatly curated shopping guide. To cement their status as the untouchable kings of the industry, the company decided to build a monument to its own power. In November 2001, Toys R Us opened a colossal 110,000 square foot flagship store right in the heart of New York's Times Square. It was the largest toy store in the world, and it completely blurred the line between retail and a theme park. Visitors were greeted by a massive 60-foot indoor Ferris wheel, with each car themed after a different classic toy. On the second floor, a towering 20-foot animatronic Tyrannosaurus Rex roared at terrified and delighted children, a nod to the Jurassic Park craze. There was a life-sized Barbie dollhouse and an elaborate fortress made entirely of Legos. It was an architectural manifestation of their dominance, loud, spectacular, and seemingly invincible. By this period, the numbers were staggering. The company was operating over 1,400 stores worldwide and generating more than $11 billion in annual revenue. They had vanquished the small neighborhood shops and commanded absolute loyalty from both manufacturers and consumers. But absolute power often breeds a dangerous complacency. Deep within the brightly lit aisles, a subtle rot was beginning to set in. The executives sitting in their corporate headquarters had fallen in love with their own reflection. Because Toys R Us had no serious rivals in the toy-specific space, they stopped trying to improve the actual shopping experience. A stark divide emerged between how children and adults perceived the store. For a child, it was a magical palace, but for a parent, especially on a crowded Saturday afternoon in mid-December, it was increasingly becoming a chaotic, exhausting nightmare. The massive warehouses were notoriously difficult to navigate. Aisles were often left cluttered with misplaced merchandise, inventory was stacked hazardously high to the ceiling, and finding a helpful employee in the sprawling 40,000 square foot footprint felt like a frustrating scavenger hunt. Leadership believed this didn't matter. The prevailing corporate mindset was a fatalistic arrogance. Where else are they going to go? Parents had to endure the messy aisles and the long checkout lines, because if little Timmy wanted the season's hottest toy, Toys R Us was the only place guaranteed to have it in stock. They believed their category killer model was bulletproof, but this hubris created a massive blind spot. While Toys R Us executives were busy celebrating their absolute victory over traditional toy stores, they were completely ignoring a new breed of predator. They failed to realize that the American retail landscape was shifting beneath their feet, and the next threat wouldn't come from another toy store. It would come from the sprawling, hyper-efficient discount supercenters quietly expanding their footprint just a few miles down the highway. The Palace of Dreams was heavily fortified against the enemies of the past, but its gates were wide open to the giants of the future. While the mechanical T-Rex roared in the Times Square flagship store, distracting executives with its spectacular display of dominance, a quiet but lethal revolution was unfolding in the sprawling parking lots of suburban America. Toys R Us had spent decades fortifying its defenses against other toy retailers, completely crushing traditional mom-and-pop shops and regional chains. But their impenetrable fortress was about to be breached by an entirely different kind of invader, one that didn't play by the established rules of the toy industry. The threat materialized in the form of massive, aggressively expanding discount supercenters, Walmart and Target. These retail behemoths were pioneering the everything under one roof philosophy, transforming the way Americans shopped for their daily necessities. And they had set their sights squarely on the lucrative family demographic that Toys R Us had monopolized for decades. For Walmart, toys were not a sacred, standalone business. They were simply another tool in a much larger, more ruthless retail strategy. To understand the devastating blow these supercenters dealt to Toys R Us, one must understand the concept of the lost leader. During the crucial fourth quarter, the holiday shopping season where toy retailers make or break their entire year, Walmart began deploying a terrifying pricing tactic. They would take the season's hottest, most sought-after items, whether it was a Furby, a Nintendo console, or a Tickle Me Elmo, and slash the price down to cost, or sometimes even below wholesale cost. Walmart was willingly bleeding money on these high-profile toys. To Charles Lazarus's empire, this strategy seemed mathematically insane. But for Walmart, it was a calculated sacrifice. They knew that a parent drawn in by the irresistible price of a discounted action figure wouldn't just buy the toy and leave. While in the store, that same parent would inevitably pick up groceries, winter clothing, household appliances, and toiletries. The profit margins on those everyday items more than compensated for the money lost on the toy. Toys R Us, on the other hand, had no such safety net. Because they exclusively sold toys, games, and baby products, they absolutely had to make a profit on those items to survive. They could not afford to use their core inventory as bait. Suddenly, the very foundation of the category killer model, the promise of offering the absolute lowest prices on toys, was completely neutralized. Furthermore, the supercenters attacked Toys R Us on the battleground of convenience. As the 1990s progressed, American families were becoming increasingly time-starved. The prospect of driving across town specifically to navigate the crowded, chaotic aisles of a standalone toy warehouse began to lose its appeal. Why endure the friction of a separate trip to Toys R Us when a mother or father could effortlessly toss the latest Barbie or Lego set into their shopping cart right next to the milk, bread, and paper towels? The magic of the toy store was rapidly being eclipsed by the ruthless efficiency of the one-stop shop. The turning point in this retail war arrived in 1998, a year that would forever be etched as a dark milestone in the company's history. For the first time ever, Walmart officially surpassed Toys R Us to become the #1 seller of toys in the United States. It was a seismic shift. The category killer had just been dethroned in its own exclusive category. This was not merely a loss of market share. It was a devastating psychological blow to an empire that had believed itself invincible. Inside the corporate headquarters in Wayne, New Jersey, panic began to set in. The executives, who had spent decades dictating terms to the entire industry, suddenly found themselves playing a desperate game of defense. In a frantic bid to reclaim their crown, Toys R Us attempted to engage the discount supercenters in a brutal price war. They slashed price tags on their most popular items, trying to match Walmart in Target dollar for dollar. But it was a suicidal strategy. Because Toys R Us lacked the diverse, high-margin inventory of a supercenter, like groceries, clothing, and electronics, to subsidize these deep discounts, their profit margins were violently eroded. Every time they matched a Walmart price on a hot holiday item, they bled capital. The once unstoppable financial engine of the company began to sputter. As profits thinned, the company began to cut corners on store operations to save money. The already chaotic warehouses became even harder to manage. Staffing levels were aggressively reduced, leaving frustrated parents wandering through dimly lit, disorganized aisles with no employees in sight to help them locate a specific action figure or board game. The magical atmosphere that had defined the brand in the 1980s was rapidly deteriorating into a bleak, exhausting chore. Furthermore, the shifting retail landscape completely upended the power dynamic with the toy manufacturers themselves. For years, companies like Mattel and Hasbro had bowed to the demands of Toys R Us because the retailer was their primary artery to the American consumer. But as Walmart's toy aisles expanded and their purchase orders ballooned into the tens of millions, the manufacturers realized they had a new, even larger partner. They no longer had to tolerate the heavy-handed dictatorial tactics of Toys R Us. The loyalty of the suppliers inevitably shifted toward the highest volume buyer, leaving the former king of toys with diminishing influence over the very products it relied on. The empire was under siege from all sides, its core business model fracturing under the relentless pressure of the supercenters. Yet the leadership failed to fundamentally reinvent the brand. Instead of overhauling the burdensome shopping experience or fostering a deep, service-oriented relationship with their customers that Walmart couldn't possibly replicate, the executives began scrambling for quick fixes. They needed a miracle to appease Wall Street and mask the rapidly declining profits. Unfortunately, this blind desperation would lead the company directly into a series of catastrophic partnerships and financial traps. The shadow of the supercenters had darkened their aisles, but the truly fatal blow was about to be delivered from within. As the new millennium dawned, a new digital frontier was rapidly materializing. The internet was transitioning from a novelty into a fundamental utility, and the concept of e-commerce was beginning to take root in the minds of American consumers. For a company already reeling from the physical onslaught of discount supercenters, the digital realm should have been a lifeline, a fresh battleground where Toys R Us could leverage its immense brand recognition to dominate online toy sales. Instead, they made a catastrophic strategic error that would cripple their future. In the year 2000, desperate to establish a web presence without the heavy lifting of building a digital infrastructure from scratch, Toys R Us executives signed what they believed was a masterstroke of a contract. They entered into a 10-year partnership with a rapidly growing, but still relatively unproven, online retailer called Amazon.com. The terms seemed mutually beneficial. Toys R Us would pay Amazon $50 million a year, plus a percentage of sales, in exchange for being the exclusive seller of toys and baby products on Amazon's platform. The toy giant effectively surrendered the keys to its digital future, outsourcing its entire e-commerce operation to a third party. It was a deal struck in desperation, and it backfired spectacularly. As the partnership progressed, Amazon began to realize the sheer volume and profitability of the online toy market. Ignoring the exclusivity clause of their agreement, Amazon soon allowed other third-party vendors and competing toy retailers to sell their merchandise on the platform. Toys R Us suddenly found itself competing against countless other sellers on the very website it was paying tens of millions of dollars to dominate. Furious and betrayed, Toys R Us sued Amazon in 2004, eventually winning the legal battle. But the victory was entirely Pyrrhic. While they won a financial settlement, they had lost something infinitely more valuable: time. By outsourcing their digital presence during the most critical, foundational years of the internet age, Toys R Us had failed to develop its own independent, robust e-commerce platform. While competitors were learning the intricacies of digital fulfillment, online customer service, and web design, the world's biggest toy store had effectively hit the pause button on its own technological evolution. By 2005, the situation had grown dire. The disastrous Amazon experiment had left them digitally crippled, while Walmart and Target continued to relentlessly siphon away their physical customers. The company's stock price was stagnating, and shareholders were growing increasingly impatient. The corporate board, completely out of innovative ideas and desperate to escape the intense, unforgiving scrutiny of the public market, began searching for an exit strategy. They found their supposed saviors in the sleek, high-stakes world of Wall Street private equity. In a monumental transaction valued at $6.6 billion, Toys R Us was acquired by a consortium of three powerful firms: Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado Realty Trust. The board celebrated the buyout as a necessary reset. Going private would shield the company from the quarterly demands of the stock market, supposedly giving them the breathing room required to restructure and revitalize the brand away from the public eye. But this was not a rescue mission. It was a leveraged buyout, a complex financial maneuver that would soon prove to be a literal deal with the devil, setting the stage for the empire's ultimate destruction. To truly comprehend the death of Toys R Us, one must look past the rising dominance of Walmart and the disastrous missteps with Amazon, and examine the cold, mathematical reality of a leveraged buyout. When KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado acquired the retailer for $6.6 billion, they did not use their own money to fund the entire purchase. Instead, they put down a fraction of the cost, roughly 20%, and borrowed the rest. The catastrophic catch of an LBO is that this massive debt is not held by the private equity firms. It is immediately transferred onto the balance sheet of the acquired company. Overnight, Toys R Us went from being a relatively stable retail giant with manageable liabilities to a corporation suffocating under more than $5 billion in debt. Before the buyout, the company had the financial flexibility to weather bad holiday seasons, invest in store renovations, and experiment with new retail strategies. After the buyout, every single financial decision was dictated by the desperate need to service the crushing interest payments. The math was simply unforgiving. Toys R Us was suddenly forced to pay roughly $400 million a year just in interest. This was not money going toward buying better inventory, paying higher wages to retain good employees, or building the independent e-commerce infrastructure they so desperately needed. It was money vanishing into the void of Wall Street, enriching the very firms that had engineered the buyout. The private equity owners essentially treated the retail giant like a massive ATM. They stripped the company of its valuable real estate assets, selling off prime store locations and forcing the company to lease them back at exorbitant rates. This practice, known as a sale-leaseback, provided immediate cash for the investors, but crippled the long-term operational health of the stores. While executives in New York boardrooms were shuffling papers and extracting management fees, the physical reality of the stores began to reflect the severe financial starvation. Store managers were ordered to slash payrolls to the absolute bone. The once vibrant aisles, previously maintained by armies of dedicated staff, were left neglected. Floors went unpolished. Burned-out fluorescent lights were left unreplaced, and the overall shopping experience degraded from chaotic to downright depressing. The leveraged buyout was pitched as a strategy to save the company from the pressures of the public market. In reality, it was a financial straitjacket. It robbed Toys R Us of the agility required to compete in a rapidly evolving 21st century retail environment. Whenever a new threat emerged, whether it was a new tactic from Target or the meteoric rise of digital storefronts, the executives at Toys R Us could not respond. Their hands were tied by the debt. They were forced to fight a modern retail war using outdated weapons, all while carrying a $5 billion weight on their backs. The foundation of the empire had not been destroyed by competitors. It had been systematically dismantled from the inside by the very people claiming to save it. As the calendar turned to the 2010s, the American retail landscape was undergoing another seismic mutation. The smartphone had placed the entirety of the global marketplace directly into the pockets of consumers. Amazon had evolved from a simple online bookseller into a ruthless, omnipresent fulfillment machine, pioneering two-day shipping and training parents to expect maximum convenience. To survive in this hyper-connected, fast-paced era, physical retailers needed to offer something digital storefronts could not: an impeccable, engaging, and frictionless in-store experience. Toys R Us, however, was fundamentally incapable of providing this. While their competitors were heavily investing in sleek store redesigns, interactive displays, and robust omni-channel integration, the former Toy King was paralyzed. The suffocating $5 billion debt inherited from the 2005 leveraged buyout acted as a financial anchor, dragging down every attempt at modernization. Because hundreds of millions of dollars were being siphoned off annually just to pay the interest on that debt, there was simply no capital left to invest in the stores themselves. The physical manifestation of this financial starvation was stark and deeply depressing. To the generation of parents who had grown up in the 1980s and 90s, returning to Toys R Us with their own children felt like visiting a decaying monument to their youth. The magical Palace of Dreams had aged poorly. Customers walking through the automatic doors were no longer greeted by a state-of-the-art wonderland. Instead, they found fading neon signs, scuffed linoleum floors, and a pervasive sense of neglect. The interactive displays that once captivated children were often broken or missing parts, sitting dead on the shelves. The towering aisles, once a symbol of endless abundance, now felt claustrophobic and haphazardly organized. The highly curated, vibrant atmosphere of the past had been replaced by the sterile, grim ambiance of a failing warehouse. To offset the crushing debt payments, corporate leadership aggressively squeezed the only controllable expense they had left: payroll. Store managers were forced to operate with skeleton crews. For a parent trying to find a specific Lego set or navigate the confusing array of new electronics, locating a knowledgeable employee became a near impossible task. The remaining staff, overworked and underpaid, were spread too thin to provide the kind of personalized service that might have salvaged the shopping experience. This degradation of the physical stores created a vicious cycle. As the stores became dirtier and harder to navigate, the friction of shopping at Toys R Us increased exponentially. For a busy parent in 2012 or 2014, the calculus was simple. Why load the kids into the minivan, drive across town, and endure a frustrating hour-long scavenger hunt in a dimly lit, understaffed warehouse when they could simply open an app on their phone and have the exact same toy delivered to their doorstep in 48 hours? Even when families did venture out to physical stores, they increasingly bypassed the dedicated toy retailer in favor of Target or Walmart. These supercenters had used the intervening years to brighten their toy aisles, lower their shelves for better visibility, and integrate their inventory with convenient pickup systems. They offered a clean, well-lit, and efficient environment. By contrast, the aging Toys R Us locations felt like relics of a bygone era, desperately waiting for a miracle that Wall Street was never going to fund. Despite the glaring physical decay of their stores, the corporate leadership at Toys R Us did make sporadic, desperate attempts to course-correct. They understood that the category killer model was bleeding out, so they tried to pivot toward experiential retail. They launched pilot programs, redesigning a handful of locations to feature play areas, augmented reality games, and interactive unboxing stations. They wanted to give children a reason to actually play inside the store rather than just walk down the aisles. However, these initiatives were nothing more than band-aids on a gunshot wound. Because nearly every available dollar was being aggressively funneled toward Wall Street to service the $5 billion leveraged buyout debt, The company simply could not afford to roll out these modernizations on a national scale. For every one store that received a bright, interactive facelift, there were 99 others that remained trapped in a grim, decaying state from the 1990s. The brand messaging became hopelessly fractured. A child might see an advertisement for a magical, interactive Toys R Us experience, only to arrive at their local strip mall and find a dimly lit warehouse with empty shelves and broken display cases. As the decade wore on, another crucial pillar of their business began to crumble: the absolute loyalty of the toy manufacturers. In the golden era, companies like Lego, Hasbro, and Mattel needed Toys R Us as a physical showcase for their entire product lines. But in the 2010s, these manufacturers were increasingly building their own direct-to-consumer digital ecosystems. Why share profits with a struggling, debt-ridden physical retailer when they could sell a Star Wars Lego set directly to a parent via their own website or through Amazon's hyper-efficient fulfillment network? Toys R Us was no longer the all-powerful gatekeeper. They were rapidly becoming an unnecessary middleman. The fatal blow to this chapter of decline came not from a single bad holiday season, but from the terrifying reality of the corporate calendar. The massive debt structure engineered by KKR, Bain Capital, and Vornado was not a static burden. It had maturity dates. As 2016 bled into 2017, the executives stared down a financial cliff. Roughly $400 million in debt was coming due in 2018, and they did not have the cash to pay it. In previous years, a retailer of their size might have simply refinanced the debt, kicking the can further down the road. But the financial world had drastically changed. A phenomenon dubbed the retail apocalypse was sweeping across America, claiming the lives of dozens of iconic mall brands. Wall Street lenders, spooked by the relentless dominance of Amazon, completely lost their appetite for brick-and-mortar retail debt. When Toys R Us went looking for a lifeline to refinance their looming obligations, the credit markets slammed the door in their face. The aging warehouses, having waited years for a financial miracle that would never arrive, were suddenly out of time. The slow, agonizing decline had reached its terminal velocity. The company was careening toward a catastrophic liquidity crisis, and the timing could not have been worse. It was the late summer of 2017, and the most crucial season of the year, the holiday shopping rush, was standing right at the door. In the retail industry, the holiday season does not begin in December. It begins in late summer. August and September are the critical months when toy retailers place their massive orders, filling their distribution centers with the merchandise that will generate the vast majority of their annual revenue. But in August 2017, as the management team at Toys R Us prepared for the most important quarter of the year, whispers of the company's severe liquidity crisis began to leak to the financial press. News outlets reported that the retailer was actively consulting with restructuring lawyers. That single headline triggered a catastrophic chain reaction. The relationship between a retailer and its suppliers is built entirely on a foundation of credit and trust. Historically, manufacturers would ship millions of dollars worth of toys to Toys R Us and allow the company 30 to 60 days to pay the invoice. But the moment the rumors of an impending financial collapse surfaced, that fragile trust evaporated overnight. Panic swept through the toy industry, from massive conglomerates like Hasbro and Mattel down to small, independent board game creators. Vendors suddenly realized that if they shipped their products on standard credit terms, they might never see a single dime in return. Terrified of being left with massive unpaid invoices, the suppliers collectively slammed on the brakes. They issued a brutal ultimatum to the retail giant. They would not put a single box of merchandise on a delivery truck unless Toys R Us paid for it in cold, hard cash up front. It was a sudden and lethal death spiral. Toys R Us, already bleeding cash to service its enormous leveraged buyout debt, simply did not have the hundreds of millions of dollars required to pay up front for an entire holiday season's worth of inventory. Yet if they could not secure that inventory, their shelves would be bare during Christmas. Without Christmas sales, the company would instantly die. Backed into a corner and rapidly running out of time, the executive board made a desperate move to save the holiday season. On September 18, 2017, Just weeks before the crucial shopping period was set to begin, Toys R Us officially filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The primary goal of this legal maneuver was not liquidation, it was survival. By entering Chapter 11, the company hoped to hit the pause button on its existing debts and secure a specialized form of emergency funding. They successfully obtained a $3 billion financial lifeline, which they believed would reassure their panicked vendors, allow them to restock their shelves, and give them the breathing room necessary to restructure their massive obligations. Management publicly promised that the stores would remain open and that the upcoming Christmas season would proceed as normal. However, the psychological damage had already been done. When the bankruptcy filing hit the national news, it sent a shockwave through the American public. Parents, reading the headlines, began to doubt whether the stores would even be open by December, making them hesitant to purchase gift cards or layaway items. Competitors like Target and Walmart immediately smelled blood in the water, aggressively ramping up their own holiday toy marketing to capture the fleeing customers. The Chapter 11 filing was supposed to be a protective shield, but it had inadvertently painted a massive target on the company's back. The $3 billion debtor-in-possession financing was supposed to be the magical cure that would guarantee a profitable Christmas. But the reality on the ground was far grimmer. Despite the massive influx of cash, the supply chain had already been fatally disrupted. Many of the most sought-after toys of 2017, the specific items that actually drove foot traffic into physical stores, never made it to the shelves in sufficient quantities. Wary manufacturers, still traumatized by the sudden bankruptcy filing, prioritized their shipments to more stable retailers, like Target, Walmart, and Amazon. As December arrived, the physical state of the stores reflected the grim corporate reality. In a desperate bid to conserve cash, headquarters had drastically slashed seasonal hiring. During what should have been their busiest, most joyous weeks, Toys R Us locations were severely understaffed. The shelves, missing the season's most coveted items, were left disorganized and hollow. The festive magic that once defined the brand was entirely absent, replaced by a lingering sense of doom. Consumers are remarkably intuitive. They could immediately sense the decay. Parents walking into the dim, chaotic aisles didn't feel the nostalgia of their own childhoods. They felt the anxiety of a dying business. Furthermore, the relentless convenience of Amazon and the aggressive holiday discounts from big box competitors meant there was absolutely no logical reason to endure the frustrating Toys R Us experience. As a result, foot traffic plummeted. When the crucial holiday season concluded and the financial dust settled in early 2018, the results were catastrophic. Sales had fallen disastrously short of projections. The company had burned through a significant portion of its emergency bankruptcy loan without generating the revenue needed to justify its continued existence. This dismal performance completely shattered whatever fragile faith the creditors still held. The Wall Street lenders, the private equity firms, and the suppliers all looked at the holiday balance sheets and came to the exact same chilling conclusion. Toys R Us was no longer a viable business. There was no magical restructuring plan that could outrun the $5 billion debt and the fundamentally broken store model. The Chapter 11 reorganization, which had been pitched as a temporary shield to save the company, rapidly mutated into a different kind of legal reality. The lenders realized that the only way to claw back any of their money was to stop the bleeding immediately and sell off the remaining assets. The mission shifted overnight from a rescue operation to a controlled demolition. The executives were forced to draft the announcement that everyone had feared, but no one wanted to believe. The empire was not going to be saved. The toys were going to be liquidated, the doors were going to be permanently locked, and the mighty category killer was going to be completely erased from the American landscape. The devastating reality that the American public and the remaining workforce had been dreading finally materialized on March 14, 2018. The hollow optimism of the Chapter 11 reorganization was officially abandoned. Inside the corporate headquarters in Wayne, New Jersey, CEO David Brandon delivered the fatal blow to his staff. Toys R Us, the once undisputed king of the toy industry, was entirely out of time, out of money, and out of options. The company was shifting into full liquidation. All 735 remaining locations across the United States would be permanently closed. In a matter of minutes, an empire that took 70 years to build was officially sentenced to death. The human cost of this collapse was staggering. Overnight, approximately 33,000 employees realized they were losing their livelihoods. These were not high-paid executives. They were store managers, cashiers, and warehouse workers, many of whom had dedicated decades of their lives to the company. They were the people who had assembled bicycles on Christmas Eve, who had organized chaotic aisles after a weekend rush, and who had physically maintained the magic that defined the brand. Yet the true tragedy of the liquidation was not just the abrupt loss of jobs, it was the profound betrayal that accompanied it. As the company was readied for the chopping block, the brutal hierarchy of modern corporate bankruptcy was laid bare for the entire world to see. The Wall Street private equity firms, Bain Capital, KKR, and Vornado, had already extracted hundreds of millions of dollars in management fees during their tenure. The specialized bankruptcy lawyers and financial advisors orchestrating the liquidation were mathematically guaranteed their exorbitant hourly rates. Even the top corporate executives had secured millions in retention bonuses just before the initial bankruptcy filing, supposedly to keep them from abandoning the sinking ship. But for the 33,000 frontline employees who had kept the automatic doors opening during the company's darkest days, there was nothing. Because the company was liquidating under the crushing weight of its insurmountable debt, the workers were legally classified as unsecured creditors. They were coldly informed that their accumulated vacation time was void and, most devastatingly, that they would receive absolutely zero severance pay. The dedicated people who had built the profits and sustained the daily operations were left entirely unprotected, abandoned without a safety net, while the financial architects of the company's destruction walked away financially unscathed. This stark injustice violently transformed the narrative of the collapse. The demise of Toys R Us was no longer viewed simply as a casualty of Amazon or shifting consumer habits. It had become a glaring, unforgiving symbol of the ruthlessness of leveraged buyouts and unchecked corporate greed. The cheerful mascot, Geoffrey the Giraffe, was no longer just a symbol of childhood joy. He had become the tragic face of a workforce that had been systematically drained of its value and then discarded onto the street. The death of the toy empire was not merely a retail failure. It was a profound human tragedy. As the spring of 2018 progressed, the final phase of the Toys R Us saga began, the liquidation sale. The operational control of the remaining 735 physical locations was effectively handed over to professional liquidators, specialized firms whose sole purpose was to extract every last cent of value from the dying corpse of the company. Almost overnight, the cheerful, familiar signage that had welcomed generations of children was plastered over with garish, oversized yellow and red banners screaming, "Store closing, nothing held back, and everything must go." The announcement of the final liquidation triggered a bizarre, melancholic phenomenon across the country. Millions of Americans who hadn't set foot inside a Toys R Us in years suddenly rushed back to the stores in droves. For some, it was merely the pragmatic allure of deep, unprecedented discounts. But for a vast majority, it was a deeply emotional pilgrimage. Millennial parents, who had grown up memorizing the famous television jingle, brought their own young children to walk the aisles one last time, desperately trying to capture a fleeting piece of their childhood before it was bulldozed into history. However, the reality of these final shopping trips was profoundly unsettling. The magic of the category killer was entirely gone. The liquidators operated with a cold, ruthless efficiency, transforming the once joyful retail palaces into dystopian scrapyards. Because the mandate was absolute liquidation, the merchandise on sale was not limited to leftover action figures, board games, and bicycles. Literally everything inside the four walls had a price tag. The metal shelving units, the iconic shopping carts, the checkout counters, the employee break room lockers, the neon signs, and even the security cameras were tagged and sold off to the highest bidder. For the frontline employees who stayed until the bitter end, working through the liquidation period was an extended form of psychological torture. Already denied their earned severance pay, they were now forced to actively participate in the physical dismantling of their own livelihoods. They had to endure the daily chaos of aggressive, bargain-hunting crowds tearing through the dwindling inventory, leaving the once organized aisles looking like disaster zones. As the weeks passed and the inventory vanished, a heavy, deafening silence crept into the massive warehouses. The employees spent their final shifts breaking down the physical structures of the place they had called a second home. The brightly colored canyons of toys were slowly erased, exposing the cold, gray cinder block walls and the bare, scuffed concrete floors beneath. The vibrant empire was being systematically stripped down to its bare, hollow skeleton, leaving behind nothing but echoing caverns and the ghosts of Saturday mornings past. The definitive end arrived on June 29, 2018. As the clock ticked toward closing time, the atmosphere inside the few remaining stores shifted from the chaotic frenzy of the liquidation sales to a profound, funeral-like solemnity. The shelves had been entirely stripped bare, revealing vast, cavernous spaces that felt alien and unrecognizable. There was no merchandise left to sell, only memories to mourn. In those final hours, the true heart of Toys R Us was quietly on display. Employees, many wearing their brightly colored branded polo shirts for the very last time, gathered near the barren checkout lanes to share tearful embraces. Lifelong customers walked through the automatic doors not looking for discounts but simply to wander the empty concrete floors and say a quiet goodbye to a place that had shaped their earliest, happiest memories. Then an image emerged on social media that perfectly encapsulated the collective grief of the moment. Taken by an employee inside a hollowed-out store, the photograph showed a lone cardboard cutout of the beloved mascot, Jeffrey the giraffe, positioned in the center of an empty aisle. He was holding a small suitcase, waving goodbye to an empty room. The image went instantly viral, striking a deep emotional chord across the nation. The cheerful giraffe, who had spent decades promising millions of children that they would never have to grow up, had finally been evicted by the harsh, unforgiving realities of Wall Street capitalism. He was packing up and leaving a home that no longer existed. When the sun set that Friday evening, the final rituals were performed. Store managers across the country walked to the front entrances, ushered out the last lingering visitors, and turned the deadbolts. The heavy metal security grates rattled loudly as they were pulled down to the floor, sealing the stores forever. Inside, the master switches were flipped, and the massive grids of fluorescent lights, which had illuminated endless dreams for over half a century, finally went dark. The American retail landscape had lost its ultimate wonderland, leaving behind hundreds of vast, empty boxes along the highways, silent monuments to an invincible empire that had conquered the world, only to be dismantled from within. After the dust of the 2018 liquidation settled, the massive suburban warehouses that once housed the toy empire were carved up and sold off. They were slowly transformed into fitness centers, grocery supermarkets, and seasonal pop-up shops. But while the physical empire had been entirely dismantled, the intellectual property, the famous backward R, the Jeffrey mascot, and the heavy nostalgic weight of the name itself still held residual value. The brand was about to experience a resurrection, though not in the way anyone remembered. In 2019, a new entity named True Kids Brands, formed by former company executives, attempted a modest revival. They opened 2 highly experiential, small-format stores in indoor shopping malls. However, the timing was tragically unfortunate. The outbreak of a global pandemic in 2020 decimated mall foot traffic, and these revival stores quietly closed their doors just months after opening. The rights to the brand were subsequently acquired in 2021 by a brand management firm called WHP Global. This new ownership group recognized that trying to rebuild the standalone category killer model from scratch was financially impossible. Instead, they orchestrated a strategic partnership with Macy's. By late 2022, the ToysRUs brand had officially returned to the American retail landscape, appearing as shop-in-shop boutiques inside hundreds of Macy's department stores across the country, alongside a few new, large-scale flagship locations, such as the one at the American Dream Mall in New Jersey. Jeffrey the giraffe is technically back, and the colorful logo is once again visible to consumers. Yet this modern iteration is a hauntingly pale shadow of the past. The sprawling 40,000 square foot palaces of dreams that once crushed local competitors and commanded absolute authority over the toy industry have been reduced to a few modest aisles tucked away in the corner of a legacy department store. The brand name survives, but the all-powerful, independent corporate juggernaut that defined childhood for generations of Americans is definitively dead. What exists today is merely a licensed trademark, carefully packaged and deployed to capitalize on the bittersweet nostalgia of parents who still remember the magic of walking through those automatic glass doors. The story of Toys R Us is ultimately a cautionary tale written in neon and plastic. In the annals of American business history, its collapse stands as a stark warning about the lethal combination of corporate hubris and Wall Street financial engineering. It proves that no retail empire, regardless of how thoroughly it dominates its sector, is immune to the unforgiving forces of evolution. The category killer model worked flawlessly until it didn't, destroyed by executives who believed past supremacy was an absolute guarantee of future survival. Moreover, the tragic demise exposes the deeply flawed, parasitic nature of the leveraged buyout, a financial maneuver that ruthlessly prioritized short-term investor payouts over the long-term health of a beloved institution and the livelihoods of tens of thousands of dedicated workers. Yet beneath the cold financial post-mortems and the empty cinder-block walls of abandoned warehouses, the true legacy of Toys R Us endures in the cultural memory of the United States. For an entire generation of Americans, the store was much more than a point of transaction. It was an essential rite of passage. It was the vibrant backdrop of Saturday morning adventures, the absolute pinnacle of holiday anticipation, and a tangible manifestation of childhood joy. The massive physical palaces of dreams have vanished, replaced by the sterile, lonely efficiency of digital shopping carts and brown cardboard delivery boxes left on front porches. The endless, colorful aisles are gone, but the emotional resonance remains completely intact. The millions of children who grew up memorizing that famous television jingle are adults now, navigating a complex, fast-paced world. But whenever they hear the name or see the outline of a faded backward R on the facade of an old suburban strip mall, they are instantly transported back to a time of pure, unadulterated magic. In the end, the ultimate tragedy of Toys R Us is that the children who never wanted to grow up were finally forced to, because the magical kingdom they called home was quietly sold away. The collapse of Toys R Us offers a sobering reflection on the modern American retail machine. It reminds us that no empire falls from a single fatal mistake, and a brand can vanish completely even when millions of people still fiercely love it. For decades, Toys R Us was not merely a point of transaction. It was a sprawling cathedral of consumer culture, a physical space where generations learned the simple, profound joy of wandering down a brightly lit aisle to find the exact toy they had meticulously circled in a holiday catalog. When those heavy metal security grates rolled down for the final time, the loss extended far beyond the devastating economic impact on 33,000 loyal employees or the billions of dollars evaporated by private equity engineering. What truly disappeared was a tangible sanctuary dedicated entirely to the magic of childhood. Retail at its absolute best is not just about moving inventory from a warehouse to a living room. It is about shared memories, family rituals, and a sense of community. We learned the hard way that a business thrives by its ability to adapt, but it slowly dies the moment its leaders believe that a glorious past will effortlessly protect their future. The famous backward R might still exist today, tucked quietly away in the corners of surviving department stores, but the giant, freestanding wonderland of the 20th century is gone forever. It stands as a powerful testament to the fact that in the ruthless, ever-evolving ecosystem of modern commerce, even the greatest category killer can eventually become the prey. If you have a favorite memory of walking through those automatic glass doors, sharing a Saturday morning trip with your parents, or bringing your own children to meet Jeffrey the Giraffe, please share it with us in the comments below. Your stories help keep the history of these vanished American institutions alive. If you enjoyed this documentary, please subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the rise and fall of the forgotten empires of retail history. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.